time, and I would recommend that you
What's up, guys? Cool. So I'm just gonna get started. I think it looks like everyone's here. So we're gonna talk about collapse transformation / continuously rasterize real quick. So I'm just gonna make a new comp, turn my background on, and then I'm gonna make a solid layer by hitting Command Y for new solid. And I'll make it 500 by 500 pixels. And why don't we make it like kind of a cooler color? Let's do like an orangish red, something like that. Right? I'm then going to come up to my circle mask tool and double click on it to make a circle out of that solid layer. And so this solid layer looks pretty good where it is now. Those edges, you know, feel pretty defined. They feel crisp and things like that. But oftentimes what's going to happen is you're going to take this solid layer, right, and you're going to scale it up. And what you're going to realize is that you start to get these blurry edges, right? You start, and if I really crank it up, you'll be able to see it even more. But you can see kind of how terribly pixelated that is, right? And so fortunately for a lot of things in After Effects, there's a very easy fix to this, and that's that you just click this little star down here on the layer, which is if you mouse over it, is going to say continuously rasterize. I think you're right. Yeah, for comp layer collapse transformations, for vector layer continuously rasterize, right? And so this will allow you to kind of keep sharp edges, even if you have to scale up your artwork. And this is really great for things like solid layers, for things you brought in from After Effects. I think that I believe that shape layers by default have that turned on. You can't turn it off, right? Because those are just native vectors to After Effects. But any other vector asset that you import, basically any vector that lives in this project window, so a solid or an Illustrator document, or even like a PDF, right? A vector PDF or a EPS, or any of those vector formats, SVG, right? Like all of that, you can come in and you can press the continuously rasterize, and you'll get nice crisp edges. The problem here is what happens. I'm just gonna, for the sake of easiness, going to move this over here so that it's a half screen, right? And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna call this like orange half circle, or I guess it's more like a quarter, isn't it? Okay, and then so what we're going to look at now is we're going to call this main comp. And so there might be a situation, right, where you've pre-comped this orange circle and you've put it inside your main comp, right? Very, very common thing. And then maybe what you want to do is you want to adjust the scale of this orange thing, right? And so what you might do is you might scale it down, right? I've got it at 50% there. And what you'll see is that because this is a pre-comp, right, it is basically giving me exactly what I see inside of this pre-comp, including the edges, including the borders of this frame, right? And so that is how the default comp behaves in After Effects, is that it's just going to basically flatten that inside comp and give you the result whenever you drag that pre-comp into something else. However, what happens here when we click the continuously rasterize is you'll see that our circle actually came back, right? Even though this layer is if I toggle that back off, right? Even though this layer is only this big, it's at 50%, right? 960, 540. If I turn this on, I get the whole big circle. But what you'll see is that my scale is still 50%, right? And so I can continue to scale this up back to 100%. So what this is doing essentially, right, is when you click this on for a composition, it basically says, don't treat me like an image or a piece of footage, but instead treat me as if all of these layers were in this comp and then just essentially like parented to this top level comp and affected, right? And so that's kind of the main functionality in the most simplistic terms of this button. And so what the other things that we can look at, right, are I'm going to turn this back off just for the sake of demoing this next feature, and I'm going to come back here and make this scale 100 again so that it fills up my whole frame. And I'm going to make a background in this comp, right? Maybe we'll go for like some kind of artistic sky sort of thing with a big orange sun, and I made this solid, but I'm gonna hit Command Shift Y to go back and customize it. I'll hit Make Comp Size to fill my frame, and then I'll drag it under my circle, right? And so now I have this half blue, half orange kind of abstract composition, right? Again, my collapse transformations is off in here. And then so say that I might be in this pre-comp, and maybe I'm moving some things around a little bit, and maybe I decide that I want to make an adjustment layer, right? And so if I come down here to right click and say New Adjustment Layer, you can also come up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, or you see the shortcut is Command or Control, Alt or Option, and Y. Come here, and maybe I take this adjustment layer, and I come over here to my effects and presets, and I search for hue saturation, right? And I'll double click that to apply to the layer, and I'm going to drag this over just so we can see my project panel and my effects at the same time. And so maybe what I might do is I might be like, well, I want this actually to be a little yellower, right? So I'll come over here and I'll adjust the hue until I get something that's yellow, right? And maybe I'm like, this could be a little brighter. So I take the lightness up to make it kind of more like a pale lemon, right? And maybe I'll move the saturation over to. So this is looking good, right? And then I come over here to my main comp. Exactly what you would expect happened, right? When you look inside this comp, it gets flattened, and exactly what you put on there is what you get out here. However, maybe I want to scale this, right? Maybe I want to take this down to 50%. But now I want to get my circle back, right? I want to make sure that I do that, and how I do that is I collapse transformation. So I click this, but then what you'll see is, oh no, you can see the border of that adjustment layer, right? And that adjustment layer is now behaving as if it was in this outside comp, right? So you can see that basically it thinks that you have an adjustment layer that's scaled to 50%. In this outside comp, right? And so that is kind of problematic, but you can also use this in to your advantage, right? Because what this means, one of the kind of most common uses for this is you can pre-comp grade layers, right? So say that we have, I'm just going to cut this so that it's not in there anymore, and then I'm going to kind of duplicate this main comp a couple of times. I'm going to paste the adjustment layer into them, and I'm gonna rotate them just to get a couple of different variations, right? And so there we go. Now I've got kind of this orange one, this green and purple one, and this yellow one. And then so what I'm gonna do maybe is assemble these into a larger timeline, right? So I'll grab the three of them, I'll drag them into this icon. I'll say I want to make a single composition, and I want to sequence them, which just means I want to stack them one by one, right? And so you click that, and you'll see that they come out one by one. And so there are different ways to kind of handle this next part. A lot of animators will come in here and will kind of make their grade layers in this main comp, right? So that you've got a master kind of grade that affects everything, right? So now all three of these are having, maybe I'll just desaturate them, it'll be easier to tell. Now all three of these are kind of having the same grade applied to them. But what I can also do is I can also pre-comp this adjustment layer, call this desat, move all attributes, right? Click OK, cut this comp, paste it into each of these guys, and turn on the collapse transformations. And now what you'll see is essentially the same thing is happening, is that each of my comps, when I come out to this top level, are all gray, and they're controlled by this kind of grade comp that's in here. So if I want to come in here and I want to do something like take brightness contrast and crank the contrast a little bit, right? And what I can do too is I can lock this panel so that when I come back to this comp out here, it's not going to affect my stuff. So I can basically, you can see here that I can make changes to this one adjustment layer inside of this pre-comp, and it's going to affect everywhere that pre-comp is used with the continuously, or with the collapse transformations, excuse me, turned on. And so that can be really powerful, right? That's really cool. The other thing that you can do here is I'm going to make a new comp, call this main comp, and then I'm going to make another comp and call it pre-comp. Or sorry, this is solid. Make a new comp, call it pre-comp. Put the pre-comp into the main comp, right, like that. And then outside here, I'm going to make a sky again, like we just did. And inside the pre-comp, maybe I'll make a another sun. Why not? Let's go with something like that. And then I'll make this 500 by 500. Da da da. Right. Cool. And so now I have, if I come out here, I have this kind of minimalist vector sun that's happening inside there. So something that's not uncommon to do, right, is that I might do something on this sun that I want to blend with a background, right? So like a really easy example of that is just like if I right click and go to layer styles, outer glow. So say that I want to add an outer glow to this thing, and these are basically just like Photoshop, right? I can kind of scroll down here and I can up my size, and you'll see that I get this very Photoshop style outer glow. Maybe I wanna, this is way too much, obviously. Drop it down. My scrolling is behaving very strangely. So maybe we just have like kind of an easy gradient like that. Just tweaking this, but you can see here that, you know, we have this blend mode here set to screen, right? And what does screen do? Screen is just a blending mode that basically eliminates all dark colors, right? And so just for the sake of demonstrating this, I'm going to actually turn this on to multiply, right? And so what you would see if I made a background image here, let's just pick a different color. You would see that if I put this behind, I actually getting almost no glow, right? Because that glow is all light, and it's affecting, you know, it's being multiplied on top, so you get very little color, right? So I'm going to delete that. But what you'll notice is if I come out to this main comp, even though this thing's on multiply over here, it's still glowing in this outside comp, right? But what will change when I click this is you'll see that it then becomes multiplied, right? And even furthermore, you'll see that the mode here switches to this hyphen, which basically means use the blending modes that I've assigned inside this comp, right? So it's going to look at each of the layers, again, as if they were in this outside comp and blend them according to the style. This also goes for things like we can see here, these little dashes. It goes for things like motion blur and like the quality settings that are right there. And so we can demonstrate this, right, by if I'm going to take the glow off of this actually just to be able to see it a little bit better. But if I take the glow off of this, and let's say that I animate this guy, right, so it's going to come from off screen. I'm going to move forward in time, And then I'm just going to go over, right, easy enough. And I think it's peaking a little bit, right? So then I will easy ease out, easy ease in. Maybe I will ramp this guy a little bit so that it moves kind of quickly, right? We have this little zip over there. And then what I'll do, right, is I'll enable motion blur. Yeah, I'll enable motion blur, and you'll see that we get motion blur there, right? And that is basically as we'd expect, is we get this kind of nice moment of motion blur. And so what you'll see though out here is when I have continuously rasterize on, and I'm going to turn it off just so you see it. So right, without continuously rasterize, we get the normal blur. Again, it's like this comp is being flattened, like it's being pre-rendered and brought back in. But when we turn it on, now it's saying, okay, you want me to look at the setting for each of these layers, which I've done, right? But then I also am going to be parsing these layers as if they were in this comp, right? And I don't have motion blur turned on out here. And so if I turn this on, you'll see that immediately now it's being affected. And this will be helpful to demonstrate is if I just have this circle out here, right, now it's no longer a pre-comp, it still doesn't get motion blur if I only turn this switch on, right? I need to turn the top level comp switch on as well. And so that's kind of the way that all of the switches and things behave with that continuously rasterized, right? They if you have this thing on, it basically says go inside that comp and treat those layers as if they were out here. And this also works if you continue nesting, right? Like at any point you could say stop looking at these as layers and make this an image just by leaving that collapse transformations off. So the other thing that we get here, right, is let's make this a 3D layer, right? And so now we have some 3D stuff that's happening in this comp. And you can't really see it. I'm just actually going to move the Z position back so that we get a little bit of depth to it. So I'm going to move that first keyframe to be a little bit over. Hit K to jump over to my next keyframe, and I'll move that off screen as well. And so cool. So if I come over here, right, what you'd expect is that I have, I'm going to turn the motion blur on, right, is I have this same thing just moving in this comp out here. However, something that I might do too is now maybe out here I want to make a camera, right? And I want to start moving that camera. And what you'll see is that this actually moves as if it was in this scene when I move this camera. This pre-comp is not a 3D layer, right? This pre-comp should not be affected by this camera move. And in fact, if I hit Command Z and undo this, and take this continuously rasterize off, if I move this camera, it's going to yell at me. It says, I don't have anything that's 3D in this scene. Why are you trying to move the camera? And you'll see that nothing happens, right? Because according to After Effects, this comp has no 3D elements in it right now. But even though this is a 2D pre-comp, if I say collapse transformations, it's going to go in here and see that this switch is turned on for this layer, and make that react to the camera. What's interesting on top of this is that I can still kind of move this group in 2D, right? I can move the comp out here, again, as if it was parented to kind of this master folder or null that's in here, right? And what's even more interesting is I can actually make this 3D as well, and so I can push this further back in space, right? So now I have this kind of 3D controller pre-comp out here that I can move the entire animation, but inside of it I can still kind of make this animation just in screen space, right? So somewhere that this is helpful would be, let's say that I'm going to turn this off so that we can see what happens first, and I'm going to put this back at 960, 540, 0. So it's just like right in the middle of my comp, right? And so something I might do is I might come down here and I might let me make some other 3D elements really quick. I'm going to come into here and just copy them so I can see them. And so I might, you know, move my camera down here. light A for point of interest and move that down as well. Right, and then so something I can do, right, is what you might notice is that I have this comp up here, and if I hit continuously rasterize, it's actually going to disappear, right, because now it's not on screen, right? This is a three-dimensional object that's pushed further back in space from my current camera, right? But what I can do is I can come here and hit Command Home to kind of center it in my view, and then with a little bit, I believe, of rotation, I can bring that guy back. Right, and so this is kind of a very confusing part of After Effects, is how these collapse transformations work. And because you basically, like, for a long time I just thought of this as like a make sharp button, right? Whereas if you had a blurry vector, you could click this and it would make it sharp. But actually this button, when it's on a comp, is saying go into this comp and basically treat all of these layers as if they were out here. Make them affected by my camera, make them affected by my lights, make them affected by my adjustment layers, make them affect the layers underneath them, etc. And so that is really confusing, and it's probably one of the dumbest parts of After Effects in my opinion. But there you go. That's how it works, right? And so hopefully that clears a little bit up. I also just want to jump into C4D really quick and talk about a little bit of subsurface scattering and also the concept of basic lighting really quickly. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a cube, right? I'm going to turn this fillet on, and I'm going to move the radius down so that I have this kind of like rounded cube. Better yet, you know, one thing that you get when you get Cinema, I don't actually know if I have them on my computer, but you get these presets that you can use. Let me see if there's media. OBJ preset. No, actually I don't think I have the presets downloaded on this. But there, if you look in the content browser, there's some like weird dragons and stuff like that. But so we'll just stick with the trusty old cube, and we'll fillet it. I have very full hard drives, that's why I don't have it. And then we'll make a floor. And because I know that my cube is 200 centimeters tall, I can take my floor down negative 100 to kind of stick it at the bottom, right? Another cool trick that I'll show you, and this is something that I think you can find on Grayscale Gorilla, is this floor is cool because it makes a kind of seamless, endless ground plane, but you see that it eventually hits a horizon, which is very kind of unfortunate, right? In that if you're not looking at it from a high enough perspective, you're going to see an edge, right? And so what we can do maybe is like, let's make a texture, right, for the floor. And how I'm going to do this is I'm going to make it in the color channel. I'm going to make a gradient. I'm going to come into that gradient and make it circular. I'm going to right click this, invert knots. I'm going to click a gray that I like as my kind of outside color and pull this out, right? So essentially now I just have this kind of basic psych looking material, right? I might even get a little fancy and add some some reflection into it so that I can have this floor, right? And I'm basically just trying to look at my thing up here and get it to be a point where, so you normally want really rough reflections kind of as a base layer, and then you can make a sharper reflection on top of it, and that's like a good way to simulate real reflections. I'm also going to come down here and turn on the Fresnel for both of these layers so that you get something that's a little bit right. And something too that I realized the other day is if you come here and you go to show help, documentation not found. I guess I don't have anything downloaded. It's all downloaded to work. But basically it says that dielectric is for transparent things and conductor is for opaque things. And since we're making a floor and it's going to be opaque, we'll go with the opaque one. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to drop this guy down. So I just have like a slightly glossy thing there, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop this on the floor, which is good. You might see, okay, now we have this weird checkerboard grid of everything that's going out. For normal, we have our nice reflection. In order to make it not checker like that, you can come over here and you can change the projection to frontal, right? And what frontal is going to do is basically always project it through that camera. So you can see that I have my light spot in the middle and I fade out to darker over there. But oh no, I still have this ugly horizon. And what you can do in Cinema is there's like a hidden cheeky way to be able to make a seamless background, right? And how you do that is you make this background object and you put the same texture on it. You might be like, okay, well, I'm good, right? No, you're not, right? Because what's happening here is that the background is considered kind of like a fake object or a 2D post object where it's calculated as if there's not any light hitting it, right? It's always going to be full brightness. Whereas the floor has to reflect objects, it has to do other things, so it's lit and therefore it's much darker, right? But there's a way to essentially tell the floor to be self-illuminating, which is what's happening on the background. The way that you do that is you come to this Cinema 4D tab, you right-click Cinema 4D tags compositing, and you click this compositing background. And then if I render this, you'll see that now I have this nice seamless floor that goes on forever. And not quite forever, but you'll notice that you can't really see it, but this is the edge of my where my render happens. And so if you look, it actually repeats itself. You can see that there's a crease at the end of the frame because it's essentially like a tile. But what you can do to cover that up, right, just to make sure you're not seeing it, is up the borders, and then maybe make your viewport a little bit smaller. So now I have this background, right, that is self-illuminating. But I still get this reflection, and I'm just going to crank that reflection a little bit so that you can see it because it might be a little faint on the stream. But hopefully that's a little bit clearer. You can see that there's this kind of bright area down there. But something that I want to do, because we're going to be talking about subsurface scattering, is I want to kind of actually make this a dark gradient. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick darker colors. So for the middle, I'm going to take like a pretty dark gray. And then for the edges, I'm going to take full black, right? And so what this is going to do here now is I'm going to have this kind of like cyc, essentially. And you can see here that the reflection is really kind of prominent because this is darker now, and my texture of this cube is so light. And so I'm going to call this floor, right? And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start lighting this cube, and this is obviously a very easy thing to light because it's just a cube, but it's kind of just to talk about the principles of lighting and some of the techniques that I use to make this process a little easier. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to clone this out so that I have a couple of different cubes to play with, I think. So I'll put this in a cloner. I'm going to come over to object. I'm going to come over to I'm going to change the clones from linear to this honeycomb array, which basically just gives you like an offset grid. I'm going to change the plane to be XZ, which is going to put them on the floor. And then I'm going to space them closer together so that we have something that's a little bit... And yeah, so how big is my cube, right? My cube is going to be, I'm going to click this, I'm going to make it 50, I'm going to hit Control or Command and hit Enter, it'll update all of them. So then I can come over here, make sure this is on per step, and say each one should be 50, right? And they'll be exactly touching. Boom. And then I can kind of make this bigger, and I've got this brick wall that's happening like that. That's maybe too many. I'm being a little indecisive. Okay, so I have this thing here. And then what I'm going to do, again, just for the sake of variety, is I'm going to go to Mograph, choose random effector, and I think we're just going to scale them on the Y a little bit, right? And this is a diversion, but I think it's important to talk about as well. As you can see here that when I zoom in here, because I had turned on the fillet for the cube, and then I had stretched on the Y, the fillet there is getting stretched. So how can I fix that? I can fillet it after, right? And so how I'll do that is I'll put my cloner in a null, I'll come over here and add a bevel deformer, and you can see that that basically does exactly what we need it to do, except I need subdivision so that it's round, and we're good, right? So now I have this kind of rig that is going to give me some cool effects, I hope, as we start to light this guy. Okay, so the first thing that you should do when you're lighting, right, is to choose where your camera is going to be from, or approximately where your camera is going to be from if you're moving it, right? And so the way that you can do that is you can, when you found a spot that you like, right, you can choose this camera object, and it'll make it at the view that you exist at already. And so if you see, if I scroll out, it made this camera here. And I'm going to follow that same trick that I showed you guys a few times ago, where I'm going to make a new view panel. I'm going to dock it over here next to it. I'm going to come over here to cameras, use camera, and let's call this shot cam or something like that. And then I'm going to click view and say use this render view. So that's going to make this guy what renders. And I'm going to actually change the background of these little safety areas just so that I can know that I'm not working in, I don't care about areas that aren't going to be in the final render, right? So move this up. Cool. And so now I have this view over here. Sorry. If I exit my camera over here, I have this view over here that's independent of my camera, and I can see what my camera sees through here. So the first thing I'm going to do, right, is I'm going to adjust the focal length. So let's go to like 80, right, so that we get kind of more of a macro thing. And then what I can do is I can kind of use this side view now to kind of position this camera the way that I want it. And so now I know where my camera is looking, so I can begin to light this guy. And normally what I would do here is probably use like an HDRI for image-based lighting, but we're going to do this the old-fashioned way, the very basic kind of 3 light setup way. And so what I'm going to do first, right, is I'm going to make an area light, and for the sake of easiness, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click on it, go to C4D tags, and click on target, and then I'm going to drag the floor into that target object so that as I move this light, and you can see over there, it's going to essentially point at my cubes wherever I put it, right? And so I want this to be kind of frontal, and you can see that there's a nice little display over here, and in fact, if I hit Alt-Option-R, I can make this interactive render view, which will essentially just continuously render this area, and I can use this little triangle over here for quality, right? And so what I can do now is, now because my light is pointing, I can kind of just move it until I get a result that I want. And so what this is going to be my key light, so I kind of want it to be in front of my shapes, right? And so now I have some directional lighting, and it's rendering, which is great. I want to make sure that I add some shadows as well, area shadows. And you'll see that our render time will go up, but we start to get some realistic shadows there. So now that I have a single light, I'm going to want to make a texture, so I'll just double click down here, and we're going to make kind of a cool soft surface texture, I think. And so what I'm going to do for that is I'm going to make this kind of like medium gray material, and we'll make it very slightly reflective, right? So I'm going to do the same thing. I'll add a Beckman shader. These are all basically, like, I freaked out for a long time about what the difference is between these things. They're just different algorithms that give you like slightly different results. You know, some work better on highlights, some on shadows, some on far things, some on close things, but as a whole you can basically choose whichever one you want. And if you know, if something is getting weird, you can try changing the reflection type down here to something different, which will give you a slightly different result, right? So the way that you layer reflections, right, the first thing you should always do is come down here and turn on your conductor, adjust your sorry, not your absorption, your IOR, to kind of get something that works better for you. We'll go there. Then we'll up the roughness and drop the amount overall. So now I have a really rough reflection. I'm going to add another reflection on top of it that is sharper. So I'll take that same situation. Sorry, not that. Move this over to being a little taller. Maybe I'll drop this. And again, you can do this from a very physical based standpoint where you like try and find all the numbers, but what I'm essentially doing is moving these things and seeing how it affects my image up here. And so we'll drop the reflection strength of this as well. So now I'm getting this kind of, and then I have kind of these master controls, excuse me, the global reflection controls up here that I can kind of use to just dim the reflection in specular to something that's a little bit more reasonable. So now I'll drop this onto my null, which is going to make all of my cubes that gray. You'll see my render time goes up. But now I have this texture, and I'm starting to get some reflections, right? If I crank it a little bit more, you'll even be able to see it. And you can see, I don't know if you can see it on the stream, but there are really kind of faint reflections down there. So I might, for the sake of it, turn the strength up just a bit to try and make them more prominent. And this one as well. Oh, that was the roughness. Okay, and hopefully you can see that now that there's some pretty defined reflections in the sides of these cubes, right? But we're not done because we haven't really lit this thing yet. We're only lighting the front, the beginning of it, and this is again a very long way around to show you guys the subsurface scattering. But I'm gonna make this key light a little bit yellowish, right, just so that I get a touch of warmth, and you'll see that it's subtle, but it's there. And then what I can do is I can go to my key light, and I can hit E to move it, and I can hold Control to make a copy, right? And what this is gonna do that's really cool is it's gonna actually copy the target tag too. So when I move this guy, it now is also facing the center. This is going to be my fill light, so I'll move it a little bit further away. I'll make it a little bit bigger. I'm going to come and change the color to be blue, and maybe I'll drop the percentage just a little bit. Something I also want to do for both of my lights actually is to add a little bit of fall off so that they fall off more realistically. So I'll change this to linear fall off, and you'll see now that that light is kind of doing its thing. Cool. And then what I actually want to do now as well is I want to make sure that I'm trying to create a situation in which the front of my objects are mostly dark, right? Because I want to use this kind of rim lighting to establish my subsurface scattering, right? And so I'll move these a little bit further away just so less light is hitting them, and I'm also going to call this one fill. And I'll maybe just take the amount down a little bit. So I kind of want something dark and moody. That's kind of doing it for me. I think that works pretty well. And so now what I'm going to do, right, is I'm going to copy this again, and I'm going to call it key, or not key, I'm sorry, rim. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change it from an area to a spotlight, right? And what that's going to do is it's going to give me this cone, as you can see there. But what's nice about using the cone with the target is it'll kind of point the cone at where you're trying to aim. And so this is going to be my rim, so I want it to be in the back. So I'm going to position it kind of across from my camera there, maybe not perfectly across though. And by the way, pressing W will switch between, this is called local coordinates, and then it'll kind of like go in the direction that my object is facing, or W will change it to world coordinates, which lets me move along the x-axis of the world. So I can be able to stick this a little bit to the side, and you can see over in my right preview region when I start to get too far forward, right? They start to light up, so I don't want that quite, and I can use this as a way to kind of guess and check my lighting. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this rim and I'm going to up the percentage a lot, right? Because I want this to really kind of shine on the back. And what you'll see that I'm getting now is I'm getting this rim light that's happening here, right? And it's catching on the top of some of these surfaces. It's catching on the edge. It's coming up in the reflections. I'm actually even going to crank this higher to show it even more. And so you can see what this little bit of this rim is doing. It's creating enough edges that I can get some separation from my background. I'm getting some nice variety. Obviously these are very noisy still because my samples are so low, but I don't need samples to look at this, right? I'm just kind of looking at the direction of light. And so I might move this around a little bit, and you can see that I get kind of a preview there. I can also drop the quality of this to get a faster preview to kind of see where that light is moving, and I can move that maybe somewhere in the middle, right? And maybe that's looking good. Maybe I'll make it a little bit lower, and I can also adjust the kind of spread of this light there, as well as the fall off. And maybe I'll make that bigger. But it's, so now as you can see, this is still on linear, or on inverse square fall off, excuse me. So I can say if I don't want this blowing out all of my little dudes, I can only make it blow out a few. And I'm also going to desaturate it just so that it's a little bit brighter. And you can see this nice kind of edges that I'm getting over here, if I bring that up, that I'm getting in terms of these nice kind of highlights that are wrapping around the edge, as well as these reflections, and it's all starting to feel a little bit like there's more depth, like there's more dynamism, things like that. I'm also, now is a good time to maybe add a little bit of ambient occlusion just so that we get some shadows in there. I'm also going to change it over to the physical render, and you can see here that we have this pro render too, which is the new cinema render engine. I haven't actually tried it. It doesn't look like it wants to behave on my computer, but we're going to go with the physical render, which is a traditional CPU render. And so we'll look over here. And another tip that you can do is if you come to this physical render, you change this from adaptive to progressive, right? This is essentially going to progressively render your thing. It's just going to get better and better and better and better, right? So this is a good way. This is kind of how other GPU accelerated renders work, is they just refine and refine and refine over time. And you can see that this is doing that. It's kind of slowly getting rid of the noise, slowly making it a little bit finer, etc. So I'm going to leave that like that so that I can move on to the final part of showing this tutorial, which is the subsurface scattering. So I'm going to come back to my material, and where subsurface scattering goes, right, is it's actually shooting light through an object. And let's just Google it so we all kind of know what this effect is that we're going for. And so subsurface scattering, right? And this is kind of the concept that we're looking for, right? Is this idea that there's a substance or a solid that light passes through, and depending on the thickness and the type and the material quality of that substance, light kind of passes through the object. So you see it pretty often on the edges of fingers, on earlobes like this down here, but also like it's used to great effect to make kind of some really nice kind of jade or marble or stone things. And also you can just use it kind of creatively to do whatever you want. But so what is happening here is we're dealing with the transmission of light, right? We're trying to shoot light through an object. And how are we going to do that? We're going to do that with luminance, right? Because luminance is putting out light through our object, right? And so I'll come over to luminance, and you'll tick it on, and you'll see immediately that I get everything becomes very white, which is not what I want because it's self-illuminating. So what I can do is I can come over here to textures, and come over here to surfaces, I believe. No, effects, then subsurface scattering. And what happens immediately is that my render time takes a massive hit, right? But you can see that as it starts to go, something really cool happens, right? And give it a moment to refine, is that you can kind of start to see. I'm actually just going to change this renderer back to the adaptive render so I can get something that you can see a little bit better. And I'm going to hit Shift R to render over here. It's going to calculate, do its thing. This would be a situation where it would be really nice to have a GPU accelerated renderer. Why is this taking so long? And so this is a situation that I often get into a lot of times, where I hit a render and I'm like, okay, why is this taking so long? I don't think that it should. So let's look at what's happening, right? First of all, I'm trying to render two things at once, right? I'm trying to render this thing back here at the same time that I'm trying to render the thing in the front. So that's not helpful. And then I can come back up here to window picture viewer to get my thing back, right? It's still going a little bit slow. Do I need ambient occlusion right now to check the subsurface scattering? Probably not, so I'll hit another render. Right, and do I need it to be this big? I don't, so I might come here and cut this in half just so that I can see what is going on. So I'll make this smaller, and now we'll wait. And I don't really work at home, so unfortunately my PC is not super well equipped. And so what you'll see is a couple things are happening, right? Is presently a ton of light from this backlight is being shot through our cube, and it's almost blowing it out, right? It's almost like it's not even a substance anymore. Like it's just kind of raw light caught in there. And you'll see that if I drop this percentage down a little bit, that's going to affect the way that the subsurface is behaving. And you'll see here now that it's immediately grayer, right? So I was way out here, and now I'm kind of coming down. But that's not necessarily what we want to do, right? We don't want to reduce the amount of light that is going through, because we want those nice edges and these nice highlights that we got before. What we want is we want to change the distance that this light is traveling through, right? We don't want it to travel as far. We want it to get stuck inside the object a little bit sooner. So we can do that by dropping down this path length option here. And this is going to make your render time a little bit longer, but it's going to essentially only shoot that light now 2 centimeters through my objects, as opposed to 10 centimeters. And because these cubes aren't that big, that was kind of going all the way through it. And so we'll give it another minute to calculate. We're almost there. This is a situation where I'm glad that I've switched. Okay, we're going. And this is another good thing, is do I need the physical render here, right? Like, is this a situation where if I'm just trying to demo something, if I'm trying to look at something, do I need that physicality? And the answer is probably not. So we'll drop that down, and we'll see if this goes a little bit faster, which hopefully it will. Subsurface is going to take the same amount of time in both. But so essentially what you're going to see, right, is that I'm still shooting a ton of light through here, but I'm only letting it travel a little bit of distance, right? And this is going to essentially make that look, if we go back to Google, right, that's going to be the difference between something like the finger, which has a really, really kind of dense inside that doesn't have any light come through it, and something like this down here, which has light transmission all the way through. And what you'll see as this starts to render is that's exactly what's happening, right? Is I'm getting a lot of light pouring through around the edges and kind of the exterior of the shapes, but the interiors kind of have faded out to this more middle gray, which is, again, the texture that we've chosen up here is kind of this middle gray, right? And so you'll see what's happening up here. This is a really good example, right? The edges have that really nice kind of glowy white look, whereas the middle becomes that kind of darker gray. And you can see back here that my thing is still pretty bright, and so I might actually at this point say, okay, we need to take the rim down. Maybe 500 is a bit overkill. Why don't we go to like 350, right, and see how that affects our render. And that's generally the process that you go through in order to kind of do subsurface scattering. But something that you'll notice is if I turn that rim light off entirely, is that the subsurface is basically just not going to work, right? Is that it's not going to be able to transmit light through it because the light is going to be hitting the front of the object already, right? There's no light coming from the back, and therefore the subsurface is not really going to behave. It's still going to take forever to calculate, but it's not really going to do anything, or it's going to look weird and funky, right? This just looks like totally medium gray. I'm not getting any of that kind of nice light fall off that I was getting in the other things. And so when you're doing subsurface, always remember to have that kind of strong key light behind in order to get the best results. And the other thing you can do as well is inside there, you can make these things different colors, right? So if you're looking at my preview, if I wanted to make the light that came through it blue or something like that, right, I can kind of do that in this way that I can kind of make, even though the surface is gray, I can make it emit light that's a different color. And so this can give you some pretty cool effects when you end up going with it. And so we'll try one more time. These renders are pretty brutal. But yeah, so that's I think it's 10:20. That went a little bit later than I wanted it to. I think that's where we're going to call it tonight. We're just going to give this a minute to render while we wrap up here. Again, please, well, first of all, thank you everyone for coming and hanging out, and thanks for all the hard work that everyone's put in so far this term. And I'm really excited that as we move towards these last couple of classes that we'll get to see some cool stuff. And so again, no class next week. We're going to meet the week after next. That's 2 weeks from now. Let's try and, everyone should have a couple of storyboards or style frames at that point, or animations if you're working on the animation, right? I have no problem with you just taking stills of your animation to make your storyboards. I think that's totally cool. But yeah, oh look, this is kind of coming through. So even though these were kind of gray, we're now getting this kind of like weird cotton candy blue that we chose over here, but we're still getting desaturation in the center of those objects, right? The blue is only coming through where the light is making it all the way through the object. And you can add gradients and things like that, which is how you get these kind of effects, right? Where you have this kind of dark purple that fades out to yellow. You can use gradients and things like that to make that effect work. And so yeah, so that's it. 2 weeks. Next time we'll see you guys. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything like that, hit me up on Slack. Most of you have been, pretty good about talking and asking questions, and that's the way you learn, right? Is that you just have to keep asking, keep trying, keep exploring, keep doing dailies, keep doing things, keep working at it, right? So please hit me up if you guys need anything. Otherwise, have a great rest of your week and next week, and I will see you in 2 weeks. If not on Slack earlier. Have a fantastic night, everybody. Thanks for coming.